Welcome to another episode of the Talking Heels podcast. I'm your host, Nick Delahanty, and we are joined by a very special guest. If you follow North Carolina athletics, this guy does not need an introduction. His name is Adam Lucas. Adam, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Nick, I appreciate you having me.
So you're a busy man, so we're going to cut right to the chase, but we want to talk more about you. You're the one who's always covering North Carolina athletes, and we want to give our viewers a little chance to get to know you. So I stumbled upon a story about you in terms of how you got to this point in your career. You originally went to Carolina Law School. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I did. I made it through a whole semester. I was still academically eligible, just for the record. But then in the second semester, some of those 8 a.m. contracts classes started interfering with some of those 9 p.m. Carolina basketball games. And I had a contracts professor named Professor Hazen, who at Carolina Law School in those days, and I don't know if it's still like this today, they called on you to start a class, and then it was your day in class, and you would have to answer all that day's questions about the previous night's reading. Well, I hadn't done the previous night's reading because the Tar Heels had been playing, and that took priority. Normally, if you hadn't done the work, the professor would just hammer you and more or less just kind of embarrass you over the rest of the class. On this particular day, he asked, it very quickly became obvious I had not done the reading, and he moved on to someone else. But then he said, hey, if you don't mind, come see me after class. Well, we all know what that means. So I went up to see him after class. By that time, the classroom had emptied out. And he said, I want you to take a look at all those seats. And there were, I don't know, 100, 120 seats in the classroom. He said, the people in those seats all feel the same way about the law that you feel about Carolina sports. And honestly, that was kind of a new idea to me because I thought everyone in there hated it as much as I did. So I was surprised to hear that they liked it. But once he explained that to me, I took the hint, went down to the dean's office that same day, got my paperwork to get out of there. And then what I really needed was a job so that I could tell my parents that I had dropped out of law school because I wanted to have a job before I told them that. I thought that was really savvy thinking on my part. So I went over to the Rams Club and I took a copy of States Magazine and a copy of Duke's Magazine. And I said, hey, these are your competitors and they have magazines and you don't. And surprisingly, they said, you know what? You're right. Do you know how to do that? Well, when you don't have a job and anyone asks you, do you know how to do something? The very best answer is absolutely. So I said, of course, yes, everyone knows how to do this. And they said, great, let's do the first one in 2 months. So that gave me a month to figure out how to do it, and then a month to produce the actual magazine, and been doing it ever since.
So with that magazine, do you recall who maybe some of the initial athletes that you got to talk to for that? Do you have any stories about those?
Julius Peppers was on the cover, and to show you how good I was at magazines, Nick, the subhead on the cover was a little tiny picture of Jason Capel, and then it said, Tar Heels ready to surprise the ACC. And you know what? I was 100% right because the Tar Heels went 8-20, and that was quite a surprise. So obviously, I was just the best magazine guy in the whole wide world. But
yeah, you got it right.
It was a good call.
You got it right. And with Julius Peppers on the cover, how could you go wrong, right?
That's kind of what I was thinking.
So this magazine progresses to you becoming within Go Heels and covering Carolina basketball on a regular. Was there any kind of like pinch me moments like this is really happening for me?
Oh yeah, that's every day. That's every day I walk through the tunnel at the Smith Center or get to go on the field at Kenan Stadium or in the dugout at Boshemer. I mean, every day for more years than I would like to admit has been exactly that. And it doesn't change. You don't get any fewer chills than you did on the very first day. When I started, this job didn't really exist. Now pretty much every team has somebody who's with them. But in those days, you didn't really have you didn't have that at all on the college level, and a couple of pro sports teams were starting to kind of do it. So we just kind of made it up as we went along, and there wasn't a blueprint to say, well, you're not supposed to do this or you're not supposed to do that. And I've just kind of done whatever. If anybody says, do you know how to do this? I never say no. And I've gotten to do a lot of fun stuff that way.
Definitely seems like that. And along with being in these historical venues like the Dean Smith Center and Kenan Stadium, you've been around some legendary coaches, from Dean Smith to Mac Brown to Roy Williams. What traits do you see in them, if there's something that correlates that make them so special at what they do or what they did?
I think one kind of amazing thing is that there are a lot of different ways to be really good at it. And I also think that's what makes it so tough to hire a really good coach, because you might say, well, they're just like this other guy. Well, that doesn't mean they're going to be as successful as that person. Mac Brown, for example, is very personable. I do think he knows more X's and O's than he gets credit for knowing. Whereas somebody like a Coach Smith, for example, very X and O oriented and could tell you every second of every game before and after it happened. Coach Williams is that same way. And honestly, Coach Davis too. It always amazes me after the game. You can ask them something about something that happened in the first half, and they'll be able to tell you before they've ever watched the film what each player on the floor was doing at that exact time, what they did wrong, what they did right, who set the screen. It's not just who made the basket like a normal person would know, and maybe like the assist. It's what all five guys on each team were doing and how they're going to correct it. And that's before they ever watched the film. So that's the one thing that always stands out to me. Larry Fedora, I remember one time we asked him about the Giovanni Bernard punt return about 10 years after it happened. And from memory, he went back and named the 11 Tar Heels on the field and what they had done to contribute to the punt return. It's a gift that they have, and the rest of us probably do not.
Absolutely. Now, do you recall your first interaction with Dean Smith? If so, can you give us a little breakdown of how that went down?
Well, I grew up around Carolina games. My family would go, like it was what we did as a family was we went to watch the Tar Heels. We would go to the Diet Pepsi Tournament of Champions in Charlotte. We would all go to the ACC tournament, wherever it was. And I used to get to go to Rams Club meetings. And I remember one time, I think it was either the basketball banquet or the Wake County Rams Club meeting was at the Angus Barn in Raleigh. And somehow I lucked out and got to sit kind of towards the front, and Coach Smith was sort of at a diagonal table to me. And because I was a little kid, he sort of started talking to me. And it was right after he had gotten a speeding ticket and like coming back from a Carolina game in Charlottesville. And I was amazed that when he went up to talk, which he didn't especially like to do at those types of meetings, which I know now, he called me by name and said, I was just talking to Adam over there, and I told him to be really careful driving in that state of Virginia, which everyone thought was hilarious. But then the real Coach Smith story that always amazes me the most is that once I started working here, my daughter was born our youngest daughter was born in 2003. That was a test right there. You were testing my math. And I met with Coach Smith for maybe like 10 minutes sometime in the month or so after she had been born. And in the course of the conversation, I mentioned it and I mentioned her name, and then that was it. And that's all. Well, I saw him in the parking lot probably 6 to 9 months later, probably closer to 9 months. And as we're crossing in the parking lot, he kind of sees me from afar. And of course, I was like, oh my gosh, it's Coach Smith. And first thing out of his mouth, like without having time to think about it or anything, he goes, Adam, how's McKay doing? Which is our daughter's name. And it blew me away. Like, he has no reason to remember my kids' names. And the fact that he could do that almost a year later on an instant recall was just an incredible example of that memory that we've always heard so much about.
Yeah, that is incredible. It just goes to show how personable, and we hear so many stories about how Dean Smith cared for the people in the building and at the University of North Carolina, and that just rings true to that. Now to the guy who did follow in his footsteps a little bit, Roy Williams. What could you tell us that, the common public wouldn't know about Coach Williams?
I think the main thing about Coach Williams is that he's very much what you see. I think some folks in his position, there's kind of the public version of them and then the private version of them. He very much is that. I remember I was fortunate to be with him in Atlanta. The Final Four was in Atlanta that year when he was announced as a new inductee into the Basketball Hall of Fame. And so they had the ceremony in Atlanta. And then when the ceremony was over, of course, he didn't want to stay for the Final Four because the Tar Heels weren't playing, but he did want to go eat. So he's just been announced as the newest member of the Hall of Fame. And where do we go? We go to the Varsity, which, if you've ever been to Atlanta, is like right on par with like a medium average McDonald's. But it's kind of an Atlanta tradition, burgers and shakes and all that stuff. And so we're sitting there eating a burger with the latest member of the Hall of Fame. He goes, all right, let's flip. And I was like, for what? And he goes, to see who pays. So we flipped to see who was going to pay for our lunch at the Varsity with a new Hall of Famer, which, by the way, he had to pay. I feel like that was kind of a faux pas. Like, if you make it into the Hall of Fame, like, I can buy your burger at the Varsity. And that's just completely who he is. Like, I think some other people would go get a fancy steak or, go to some place where you dress up a lot, and that's not him.
In regards to Coach Williams, everybody says how much he loves the program, and you see that it's evident when he's at games and he's still supporting the program. We hear a lot from those people down the road that, why is he still there? What do you got to say to those people?
First of all, why do they care?
Exactly.
Are they going to the Carolina games? Why are they watching all these Carolina games?
They love Carolina.
What difference does it make? What I would say to them is he went to all these games when he was a graduate assistant selling calendars out of the back of his car. He was going to soccer games and baseball games and football games. He is a Tar Heel. And I think that's what they have trouble understanding, because they're used to someone who is accustomed to it being all about them. Roy Williams is all about the University of North Carolina. And the reason they don't know that as well is because he very much doesn't want it made public, the things he's done for all those other teams. He's not going to the games to be on television. I know that's a foreign idea to some folks at some other schools. He's going because he likes rooting for the Heels. The same reason that you would go or I would go. He likes to watch Carolina play sports. And so that's kind of his thing. Like, what's he going to do? Is he going to go like make furniture or like be a bird watcher or something? Like, his hobby is going to watch the Tar Heels, and it has been since he was an undergrad. So I wouldn't expect him to be any different in retirement than he always has been the entire rest of his life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nick, you're going to get me all fired up. You're trying to get me in trouble. You know that I just saw a certain person on TV this weekend when the Tar Heels were playing football, so you're trying to throw the grenade out there. I'm not going for it.
It was perfect timing, though, because we did see that let's not name that coach on TV, who might have sparked a little bit of this, but we'll go to our next topic here. So we talked about Coach Williams, we talked about Coach Smith. Hubert Davis, when Hubert Davis became the head coach of the Tar Heels, there was talk that, Carolina might go for a home run hire outside of the family, but they chose to stay within the family. Why do you think Hubert Davis was the ideal fit for the program?
I think because Carolina basketball is just a little bit different, and you need somebody who understands that difference and has lived it. And I think it's turned out to be right. Player after player, after recruit has talked about how it makes a difference to them that everybody on this staff played here. They understand not just how to play the game, but how to play the game at the University of North Carolina. And that's a little different. I mean, there's college basketball and then there's Carolina basketball, and those are two different levels. And I think as the transfer portal has become more prevalent, we've seen that firsthand, as some players are very well adjusted to playing Carolina basketball. And then sometimes it's hard to make that adjustment from, okay, I'm a college basketball player to I'm a Carolina basketball player. And the really solid thing about Hubert Davis's staff is everyone on that staff can speak to that. Sean May can talk about putting up ridiculous double-doubles, leading his team to a national championship. Marcus Page can talk about dealing with adversity that maybe he didn't even create, but having to answer a lot of questions from the media about things, but then going on to be one of the best players in the history of the program. Everybody's got a little something that they add. And I think the other thing about Hubert Davis that people really underestimate is his competitiveness. Roy Williams, people talk a lot about that with him because it's kind of become part of who he is. I think Hubert Davis's niceness kind of overwhelms the competitiveness in terms of the public eye. But I'm not sure if you had a head-to-head competitiveness battle between Roy Williams and Hubert Davis, I'm not completely sure who would win that. Coach Davis takes things very, very, very personally and wants to beat you in everything. And that's been a very natural transition from Coach Williams, who was very much the same way.
We've heard from, and Harrison Ingram's a player that talked about it a lot. Is it true that Hubert Davis does not curse?
Yes, that is completely true.
And do you happen to know off the top of your head some of the words that he substitutes for said curse words?
The most versatile word is bejeebies. We've had some in-depth conversations with Coach Davis about the varying ways you can use bejeebies. It could be like, what the bejeebies? It could be like, I don't know what in bejeebies that was. It could just be by itself, bejeebies. I once heard a player described as he is bejeebies. And that's not a good thing. So that bejeebies is the main one, and it can do a lot of different things.
Absolutely. Now, Hubert Davis's first year on the job, Carolina makes a pretty miraculous run to the Final Four. In your position, in your perspective, how crazy was that run, and what was different than some of the other ones that you've been around in Carolina history?
I think it gets crazier the further we get from it, when you really start to get some perspective on all that actually happened. Just the Baylor game by itself was nuts. That if that had been all that happened that postseason, we would still be saying that Baylor game was crazy. But then the Tar Heels go and play UCLA in a very underrated, high-quality game. I mean, that game was really well played. UCLA was good. Then somehow the Tar Heels get to play St. Peter's, which for some reason is in the Final 8, and the winner is going to go play Duke. So you couldn't even enjoy the fact that you're beating St. Peter's, because as soon as that happens, then you got to start stressing out about Duke. In like the be-all, end-all game of all time, Coach K coronation game, after you thought you had just had that game 3 weeks prior in Durham. I mean, the whole thing, like it. If you had written it, people would be like, Nick, come on, let's take out some of this. This is not believable when you put it all together. So just the pure theater of the entire thing, I really think the more we get away from it, the more we start to see it's unbelievable how many things went right and how many things went well during that month to six or so weeks in there. To enable Carolina to have those experiences that it had.
And let's remember, too, they were a bubble team, according to most bracketology. If you're into that, a lot of people were questioning if they were even going to get into the tournament. There they were in the Final Four. But
that's what happens when you don't play in the Mountain West. You got to really earn your way in.
Absolutely. And what do you think changed for that team? They were a mediocre team in the regular season, maybe a little above average, but what changed that made them so good come postseason play?
Yeah, the mix changed some. The personnel changed some, and that was an asset. Brady Manek started being Brady Manek, and that helped obviously a whole lot. And I think they just it sounds cheesy, but they just started believing. Like they just got to a point where they thought, someone is going to do something on any given night to enable us to win the game. And I remember, and I think what really helped was that no one else believed it other than them. And that team had a chip on their shoulder in a way that really propelled them to be better than maybe what they really were. But that's to take nothing away from how talented they were. I mean, if you go back and watch some of the film of those games, like Armando Bacot was a beast. And on alternating nights, you had RJ Davis or Caleb Love being great, and Brady Manek shooting threes from the wing. I mean, you had a Dontrez Styles stepping up miraculously and making a three that when you really needed it. That was just the kind of time period that it was, like we said, 6 weeks or so, that just enabled them. They believed it, and they liked that no one else believed it. And their coach really liked that no one else believed it. And for that close to the season, they were able to bring it all together.
Now, I don't know if you agree with this, but we all talk about the Caleb Love shot against Duke in the Final Four. But the Dontrez Styles shot was just as big for the Tar Heels in that game.
I don't think Carolina beats Baylor if Dontrez Styles doesn't make that shot, in which case there is no Caleb Love shot. And we're not sitting here talking about 2022. So, yes, I mean, that was a huge shot. That whole game overall was just ridiculous.
And then they come into the next year following that, and the expectations are high. And instead of being the underdogs, now they're the favorite. And you and I both know that when you're top-ranked team in the country, teams are going to come for you. Now, was, in your opinion, the loss of Manek such a big loss that this team couldn't recoup, or was there just, some bad luck, or what do you think went wrong that following year?
I think that team is the prime example of what we've talked about from time to time, which is you don't, just because you bring back the people from a previous year's team doesn't mean the mix is going to be the same. They will have had different experiences by the time they're on the next team. They will have had different people in their ear. Their opinions of themselves and of others will have changed, and just things are different. And that team was different. It was right at the start of NIL and kind of getting used to that and figuring out how to work that was beneficial for you individually, but also for the team. And you're kind of learning as you go with that. And I think too, I mean, let's be honest, they did really catch fire for those 6 weeks. And as you said, the time prior to that, they were not as good as that. So in some ways they kind of became what they had always been. But I think there were a lot of away from the basketball court factors that contributed to that just being a very different team, and one that was not as good as the previous year's team was in March.
And then with the NIL, or the NIL, you have the transfer portal. So after that season, everything kind of just goes chaotic, and we start to see more transfers coming into the program. From somebody who covers the Tar Heels, where it was common for guys to stay 3 or 4 years, how much different was it for the transfer portal for somebody like you, trying to cover the team? And you, from year to year, you're basically resetting your roster now.
It's really different. It's really, really different. I think the one thing that's been consistent with both Roy Williams and with Hubert Davis is they've tried really hard to bring in players who are not just coming to play basketball. Like, they do have in some way some appreciation and desire to be part of Carolina basketball. And I don't think that's how it is everywhere else. I think there are some other places that are just kind of doing it like you would do it in a video game, and let's assemble the 8 guys that have the highest rating and roll the balls out and see what happens. I think this coaching staff has taken a lot of efforts to make sure they believe, and this doesn't always happen, but they believe that this group is going to fit together in some sort of cohesive way and represent Carolina in the way that Carolina has always been represented. Now, that's making their job harder than it might have to be, because it's a lot easier to just figure out, okay, there's the best basketball players, let's go get them. They're adding an extra level of screening almost to who they're trying to select. But that's the way Hubert Davis is always going to be. He is not going to compromise that. And so I think that's the way the Tar Heels will operate going forward.
Now, from your perspective, is it safe to call the transfer portal like the Wild Wild West?
Yes. I mean, there's a lot that goes on there that people maybe don't understand. I think the general assumption is that when someone puts their name in the portal, now they're going to start exploring other schools and figuring out where they want to go. A large number of the people who are putting their name in the portal know before they ever push the portal button exactly where they're going and what the terms are of their trip to that place. And that's even changed some over the last couple of years. I think people have learned how to work it a little more effectively. So yeah, I'm not sure we're going to look back on this time period in college sports and go, wow, that was a great time where we really all had everything figured out.
And, the transfer portal opening the day before the NCAA tournament, that's really, it makes a lot of sense. Teams that go deeper in the tournament kind of get punished. Like the year Carolina made a run to the Final Four. You're worried about your Final Four team, but you also have to worry about the portal and the guys that might be on your bench that might be saying, you know what, this isn't for me, I'm out.
It's almost as dumb as when the MLB draft used to be the first weekend of the NCAA tournament. And so you'd make the baseball NCAA tournament, and at the same time you're preparing to play that first game, the most important game of your season, your very best players are worried about their professional future. So it's very much in keeping with that idea. It's funny, though, when Carolina turned down the postseason in 2023, a lot of people got mad at them. But I think the Tar Heels kind of wanted to get a jump on exactly what you're talking about. And now I think that's very much the accepted way to do it. And people understand that you do need to be making those calls and doing that scouting in a way that prepares you for next year's team.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, to transition a bit, we talked a little about baseball. I have to get on this year's Diamond Heels team, and more specifically, Vance Honeycutt. Now, guy put together an outstanding career in Chapel Hill. You guys had a chance to interview him, right?
Yes.
What makes Vance different that made him so elite at what he does?
Yeah, he's one of the best we've ever had for Carolina baseball. Jones Angel and I were fortunate enough to do baseball on the radio for a long time when the Tar Heels were going to Omaha in that stretch where they were going almost every year. And the only player I could compare Vance to would be Dustin Ackley, who it just felt like could hit anything, anywhere, anytime, roll out of bed, get 3 hits, hit a double off your best pitcher. It didn't matter. In the same way that you expected Dustin Ackley to be great all the time, I think you began to expect Vance Honeycutt to be great all the time. I think the thing with Vance is he can probably do more things than Dustin Ackley. Dustin Ackley probably is a better pure hitter, but he can't play defense like Vance Honeycutt, who might be the best defensive player Carolina's ever had, and he can't run the bases like Vance Honeycutt. So now, all that being said, Vance Honeycutt's still one of the most grounded people you'll ever find. He's actually back in Chapel Hill now and was over at Boshemer taking BP in the cage a couple days ago. Saw him over there. So loves the Tar Heels, comes from a Carolina family. His dad played for Carolina. His mom was a great athlete also. He's somebody who's going to be a Tar Heel for as long as he's doing whatever he's doing, and hopefully it's playing center field for the Baltimore Orioles.
And hopefully not doing very well against my New York Yankees. I gotta put that out there. But in terms of Vance, their run to Omaha, I think when you think of big time players in Carolina history, that home run he hit, the walk-off homer, was kind of like that moment where it was like, all right, this guy is going to go down with the legends. We knew the numbers before that, but that was the moment where the Tar Heels needed him, and he just stepped up and put together that big clutch hit.
Yeah, and you just came to expect that from him. And that was really the story of Carolina's whole postseason run, that they just got to the point where it didn't matter what the score was. It didn't matter what was happening in the 9th inning. They were going to figure out a way to win it. The problem is you get to Omaha, and there's a lot of really good teams there. And it is a hard event to win. Jones and I have talked on the podcast before. I think that's the hardest event to win of all the college sports tournaments. Because you run into one hot pitcher or your bats go cold at the wrong time, and the best team may not win, and the best team most often does not win in the College World Series. So still think the Tar Heels going to crack through and win it one of these years, but it's really hard to win.
Yeah, the way they've been recruiting and they're bringing in a lot of top tier guys, that definitely seems to be the trajectory, and hopefully it does happen in the near future. Now, you did bring up the Carolina Insider podcast, and I got to tell you, I feel like I'm your guys' best friend, listening to you guys twice a week on the pod. How did that get started?
We had no idea what we were doing. It was kind of like the magazine. Jones used to do daily shows for the Tar Heel Sports Network that would go out to all the Tar Heel Sports Network's local affiliates, and they would run them, and it was maybe like a 5-minute show each day. Some affiliates would run it, some wouldn't. Well, that format didn't make a lot of sense as we got towards like the late 2010s, and people started listening to podcasts more where they could do it on their own time rather than, okay, this will air from 7:25 to 7:30 or whatever. So Learfield had the idea that they wanted a few of their big properties, Carolina, Alabama, There were a couple others in there, but similar type brands to start a podcast. And so they came to Jones and said, "Are you interested in doing this?" And he and I sort of kicked it around a little bit. And at that point in my life, my total number of podcasts listened to was 0. In fact, I remember the day that he and I talked about it, I came home and told my wife, "Can you find me a podcast to listen to so that I know what makes one good?" And I just kind of sat down and listened. And they'll let anybody do a podcast, Nick, evidently. So we started doing that, and that was we were lucky in a way that I wasn't with the magazine. The first year of the podcast was the 2016-17 sports year. So pretty good timing on that. We had a lot of interest. And we've been so fortunate with the number of guests who've come on to talk to us, because that, as you know, that's what makes a good show. Unfortunately for you, you got stuck with me, but hopefully the next one will be better. But we've been so lucky with people who have wanted to talk about their time with the Tar Heels, both current coaches and athletes and former coaches and athletes who we always love hearing from, and some people who didn't play for the Tar Heels, which sometimes is some of our most interesting conversations.
You know, you guys have to start doing like tours of the Pod World headquarters. You know, for us common people, we would love to see where the magic happens, you know?
Maybe like Cribs Pod World headquarters style.
I think that's great. You guys have been posting the photos, like looking all tough. That could be the cover album for it, you know?
Yeah, that's right. It's always fun. There's 2 things we have to explain to every guest. And I've gotten really good at telling both these stories. We have to explain "See You Later, Big Grits," and then we have to explain why we take arms crossed, serious face pictures. And 95% of the time they get it and understand it on the first try. Sometimes they don't. And eventually we're usually able to make them understand.
Absolutely. Now, your connection with Jones Angell, you know, the voice of the Tar Heels. Tell us a little bit more about Jones from your viewpoint. You know, you get to see him on a regular basis. What makes him so good at what he does?
Yeah, I don't think people realize how hard what he does is. And I say that as someone who I didn't realize it. I grew up listening to Woody Durham. And I just thought Woody kind of showed up to the games. He loved the Tar Heels like I did, probably read the paper in the morning, went and watched the game and talked about it. It's nothing like that at all. It's so much preparation. It's watching film. It's going over bios. It's knowing the stats. It's being able to recall the history at the moment that the current relevant fact happens, that you can draw back on that past history. And also, I think there's a real – I think I'm one of the nerds who kind of listens to a bunch of broadcasts from other teams, like just when I'm driving in the car or something and it's a Saturday and there's games on, and I'll listen. I think there's a real art to being able to do that job in a way that the listeners understand that you care about it like they do, but also that you're still professional. And that's something that Woody always emphasized very much. And I think Jones has kept doing that in a way that is rare in today's team broadcasts. And it's something that I really appreciate. But just the level of preparation and the ability to think quickly, you can't script it. And things are going to happen that you have no way of being prepared for. And how do you handle those things? So it's a really unique combination of preparation and things that you can't at all be prepared for. And I think that's pretty unique for that job.
Absolutely. Now, you guys have had so many guests on the pod, so it would be terrible of me to ask who your favorite guest was. However, if you had to pick 5 guests that you could have on the show again, that entertained you guys, that you know you would love to have in a room, who would they be?
You're right. That is a terrible thing for you to say. You're always biased towards the more recent ones. So let me think about this. I mean, we would have to start with Lou Merletti, who's Matt Merletti's dad. He was the director of the Secret Service. The fact that we got to sit down with Lou Merletti is completely ridiculous, and it had nothing at all to do with Carolina sports. So he would be one. I'd really like to talk to Zena Cardman again. We had her on, and I kind of didn't even understand what a big deal it was, but she's an astronaut. So here pretty soon she's going to go into space. I think that's pretty cool. So I'd like to have her on and talk to her again. let's see. It's always fun to talk to Marcus Page. So I think you'd like to have Marcus Page there because you need the athletic standpoint. You can be able to tell some stories about some big games. For that same reason, oh boy, this is a tough one. That's three. I'm going with those three as like my. If I'm gonna have a golf foursome, I'd like to go with them. Just because I think they're pretty diverse. I think they show the nature of the podcast, but also got a little Tar Heel tinge to them, and just unique people that you don't get to hear from every day.
Oh yeah, and now on the flip side of it, and it doesn't have to be Carolina. If there's one or two people that you would like to interview that you guys haven't interviewed, who would those people be?
As you were talking, I got to put Billy Crudup in there too. I still can't believe we had Billy Crudup on. I mean, the dude just won an Emmy and just loves the Tar Heels.
Yeah.
Josh Pate's got to be in there too, the writer of Outer Banks on Netflix. The new season's getting to come out. Everybody should watch it. First part's coming out next week. Okay, so now I'm at my five.
That's a great five.
Okay, so people we haven't talked to. Michael Jordan, obviously. Would love to have him on. We'd love to have on Julius Peppers. I think he and Michael Jordan are sort of the two athletes. Maybe throw Mia Hamm in there. We've been close to having Mia on, and the timing's just never worked out. So I think those three would be three that we'd really like to talk to.
You know, talking about Mia Hamm, when I was in Carolina, maybe like a year and a half ago, I was in the store on Franklin Street, and I walked past Mia Hamm. And then I realized it after the fact. So that still bothers me to this day that I walked past Mia Hamm, but frustrating.
That's the great thing about Chapel Hill. You never know who you might run into. And I mean, as I'm sitting, so this is the problem. This is why it was terrible of you to ask that question. Eric Church. I mean, I think you'd have to put him in my group of ones that were great guests, just great to talk to, got a lot of perspective on a lot of things. But also we talked to the governor. We talked to Roy Cooper, who knows where his political career is going to take him. So the longer I sit here, the more I'm going to think of other ones who I really can't believe ever talked to us. And I would love to sit down with again.
And don't worry, I had planned to ask you about Eric Church because you went on tour with Eric Church. And let me tell you, I read your recaps of his shows and you felt like you were there. How did that come about?
I did do that, and I hope I'm going to do that again because that was a lot of fun. Eric Church is a big Tar Heel basketball fan, and not like a casual, like I'm kind of doing it for the optics type of fan, but like a he bleeds it type of fan. And so we had developed a little bit of a friendship maybe a decade-ish or so ago when I had done a story on him, and we just kept in touch. He came to a couple games, and we saw each other. I went to a couple shows and we saw each other, and we always kind of said, if you ever go on tour and it doesn't go during the course of a basketball season, I'll come out and I'll kind of treat it like a basketball season and write a story after each show. But I didn't think he ever actually would tour that way because tours usually run the same as kind of like a school year maybe. But he did an amphitheater tour in the summer of 2023 that just went right through the summer, and it was perfect. My wife and I were able to go to, I think, 32 of the 34 shows, basically 2 or 3 every single weekend for about 3 months. And his crew is just unbelievable. Number one, they're so good. They're the very best at what they do. But number two, they were so incredibly nice and welcoming to us, who they didn't have to be nice and welcoming to because we didn't know what we were doing. Kind of like I didn't know what I was doing with the Rams Club magazine. I kind of have a habit of doing things I don't know what I'm doing now that I'm saying it out loud. They were so nice. A great experience. Eric Church's fans are unbelievable. Just such nice, genuine people who really, they feel that music in the same way that we feel Carolina sports. And some of the stories we got to hear from people who Eric's music has been a big part of their life. Like, not just like, I like listening to the music, but like, this was a turning point in my life, was incredible. And so really hopeful we might get to do that again because I love being part of it. And again, his folks and him are so nice and genuine. They very much are exactly what you see. which, as I have somewhat learned as a newbie in the music business, is very rare, and something I really appreciate.
So, did you get a chance to go on stage with Eric?
Nick, they were trying to sell tickets, not send people streaming for the exits.
Well, maybe you could have been like the opening act or sing along with him. Like, what's your favorite Eric Church song?
They have actual talented people who are the opening acts. That was another thing I learned. Like, the amount of incredibly talented people in the music business is unbelievable. And how hard it is to make it is just, the odds are astronomical. So that was another thing I learned. The closest I got to being on stage was at Soundcheck the last weekend of the tour, which gets a little loose the last weekend of the tour. So everybody's kind of like playing an instrument they don't really play, or maybe like you play guitar normally, but today you're singing background vocals or something. And Jeff Cease, who's one of the guitarists, looked over at me when they were doing Soundcheck. He goes, "Hey, you want to do the vocals on this?" I was like, "No, I do not." It was "Give Me Back My Hometown," and I know the words, and they sound awesome when I'm singing them in my car, but I do not think they would have sounded awesome on that stage in Florida in front of a grand total of 0 people. So I declined that invitation. I mean, Jeff Cease used to be in the Black Crowes. Like, that's pretty big time that I don't think people even realize what an incredible career he's had, and people just know him as like, oh, he plays guitar for Eric. No, he's done a lot of other things.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what's your favorite Eric Church song?
It really depends on the day. It's funny because the ones that we heard on tour carry that weight with them, like you associate them with the tour. I really like Russian Roulette, and I like the story that goes behind it that Eric tells about how that was going to be a single, but then it didn't because some things were happening with Russia at that time, but he still really loves that song. There's a song that he hasn't even put on a record called Old Friends that is incredible. There's another song that he's kicking around right now that I think is going to be out maybe on the next album that I think is probably the best song he's ever done, that he's been playing at his residency at Chiefs in Nashville. I mean, Nick, I could talk about this all day. He's just incredibly talented in a way that we don't appreciate as normal people. The way that he can play the music, but also the way that he writes it and it can make you feel it, is something that is not normal. And it's different every time. And that was the biggest concern I had about the tour was, how am I going to write something different about 30 shows that are the exact same? None of them were the same because Eric's not willing to do them that way. And that's why they're so much fun to go to, because he's going to pull out something different every single night or play one differently than he played it the night before. And that's why all 32 that we saw were completely different.
Just like the concerts were different, every basketball game's different, and you cover Carolina basketball. And I'm always amazed that you're able to put your recap articles out so quickly and so well placed. Now, let me ask, how does that process start? Do you start writing that during the game, or is that a process where you have things already lined up, maybe like at a halftime type of thing?
So about maybe like 10-ish years ago, I made a really dumb choice to start doing 2 articles after every game. There's Rapid Reactions, which is right after the buzzer, and then there's a longer column a couple hours after the buzzer. If I had it to do over again, Nick, I would have only done one of those 2. But we've set the precedent now. Rapid Reactions kind of take shape during the game, because it's basic stuff that you saw when you were watching. Who scored the most, who made a big defensive stop, some coaching adjustments, things like that. And I try to throw in a couple things that maybe you didn't see on TV that I was lucky enough to be able to see because I was there, because that's the kind of stuff I always liked when I was reading stuff about the Tar Heels. So there'll be a couple things about like something that happened in the arena or something that I think probably wasn't on TV. That all happens during the game, and I'm sort of finishing it up the last couple minutes of the game or in the immediate aftermath of the game if it's close. The column usually doesn't – I'm not sure what that's going to be about until I hear the players and coaches talk after the game. I've always kind of thought you'd probably rather hear their perspective than mine because they know a lot more about it than I do. So I want to hear kind of like, I think I know what happened, but I want to know what Hubert Davis thinks. And whether he thinks that was important or not. So a lot of the time, it's something that they say, a player or a coach says immediately after the game, that sort of points that column off in the direction that it's going in.
Was there a player or players that really gave good perspective after games? I know it's difficult because you just played a 40-minute game and, you know, emotions are running high, but was there a player that was just able to give you, you know, a lot of detail on certain things?
I really do think that's harder than people think it is. I mean, imagine if after a bad day at work, and as soon as you walk out the door, 6 people jump on you with a tape recorder and ask you why it was so bad and expect you to be polite and thoughtful. That's not easy to do. I would throw out Marcus Page again. I mean, he always had a coach-like ability to do that from the time he was a freshman. David Noel was always really good at that. I always really liked talking to him, and not surprising that he would also go into coaching. Jawad Williams, same way. He was on that 8-20 team, and even in some of those very difficult losses, you could tell that he thought about it in a coach type way, and he's been very successful. Now that he's finally finished his playing career after he played for like 100 years and was good all 100. It seems like he's going to be a really good coach at the professional level. So all 3 of those guys, among dozens, who Sean May is another one, who also is in coaching. They're all guys who, even as players, could talk about the game like a coach in a way, but they didn't make it so complicated that you couldn't understand it. They were able to talk about it either at an elevated level or at a very base level, depending on what you needed.
Absolutely. Now, I have to ask about Psycho T. You know, you've had opportunity to be around them as a player, and now his work with the Tar Heel Radio Network. Do you ever see Tyler Hansbrough going into coaching?
I don't think so. I just don't think I don't think he has the patience. I think part of what made him so great as a player is that he didn't have the patience. I think it always confused him about why his teammates weren't willing to put in the exact same amount of effort that he was. And the answer was because they weren't able to, they just weren't wired that way. But he completely was. And so I think that would make it difficult for him to be a coach because he'd need to find a team of 10 Tyler Hansbroughs, and that just doesn't exist. There's only one.
Yeah, he was fun to watch as a player, that intensity and, you know, that drive. You could definitely see the passion still there from him, especially when he's watching games on the sideline. You see him getting all antsy and excited. Is there ever a moment where you're worried he's going to go back into Psycho Team moment where like blood coming out of his nose type of feel on the sideline?
Yeah, now he gets fired up for the games now. He does not want the Tar Heels to lose, and he takes it very personally when they don't play well. He's learned how to kind of be on this side of the media thing, and you can't, jump over the scores table and go after anybody. But there's nobody I'd rather have on my side if we've got to pick a team of Tar Heels to go fight and or play any other team of anybody else. He would be on that team.
And you mentioned this individual before, but Big Grits, Eric Montross, we lost at the end of last year. For those who didn't get the chance to know Eric as well as you did, are there any stories that you remember or recall that just tell the tale of who Eric was?
I think the thing with Eric is it's not one big story. It's thousands of really little stories. And I think that's really shown by the amount of fans we heard from during his fight against cancer and then after he lost that fight. Just the number of people who have stories about Eric being nice to them and taking time to learn their name after a game at the Smith Center, or taking the time to take a picture when they couldn't get their camera to work in a team hotel during the NCAA tournament. The unbelievable amount of work he did for causes here in Chapel Hill and beyond. There were people who didn't even really know him as a basketball player, and I think that's what I probably didn't appreciate as much, because that just wasn't the sphere I was in. Was some people didn't care that he played basketball or weren't even Tar Heel fans, and most of the people we come in contact with, their fans are fans because they are Tar Heels. Many of Eric's fans were not Tar Heels, and in fact might have even hated the Tar Heels. But because of the person he was, they were Eric fans. And that's why his impact is so much greater than anyone who could put a ball in a hoop or anything like that. And that's why all of us were so lucky to be his friend. And honestly, why we miss him so much, and not just during basketball season, but every single day.
Now, I'm sure it's up there, but was that the hardest broadcast that you and Jones have done following his passing? Because I remember I was sitting home listening to it and I was sobbing with you guys. You know, it was upsetting for me. I'm sure it was extremely difficult for you guys to handle.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we were the very least of the concerns. But that 2 weeks was a challenge, personally, mostly, but also, well, personally, every day since then, but professionally, that time period also, just because, like people want to hear something. And what's the line between, do they need to know how we're really feeling? And is it okay to kind of lift that shroud a little bit? Or do we need to play it straight down the middle and try to be very professional? And I hope we met somewhere in the middle on that. Some of those podcasts were, of course, extremely tough, and those are ones I don't go back and listen to. And then that broadcast in Charlotte, the first game after Eric passed, that is not one I want to hear again anytime soon. And I mean, I think what people probably realize now, the one before that in Atlanta, when we knew that things were not going well but couldn't talk about it, that was a different kind of tough.
Absolutely. I'm sure it was difficult for you and Jones, and it's hard to make that line and to understand like certain situations, because that type of thing doesn't happen every day, where somebody's so special, who's dealing with something so big and impacted so many lives. We lost that life, and you, in that perspective, you're trying to keep that professionalism, but you're also human, so it's difficult to find the right balance there.
Yeah, I think the guiding principle there has been Eric's family, his wife Laura and his kids Sarah and Andrew, and Andrew's fiance Megan. I mean, they've really showed us how to do that, because of course it's been so much more difficult for them. They've lost someone who was a part of their lives every single day and continues to be. And the way they've handled it and the way they've continued to be out in the community and spreading what Eric was doing for everyone, during his time here with us, has been so inspirational. And I think we're all just trying to kind of take their lead and do a little bit. It's kind of like what we did with Eric. We couldn't do what Eric did, so we tried to do a little tiny bit of what Eric did. Now we're trying to do a little bit of what Laura, Andrew, Sarah, and Megan are doing, just to kind of try to bring a little bit of Eric in the world. My thing is, I'm trying to do better with asking people their name and remembering their name, because Eric was so good at that. So I've really made a conscious effort these last 9 months or so to really take the time to focus in on that. And every time I do it, it makes me smile a little bit, because I think, man, this came natural to Eric, but it does not to me. So I'm working on it, big fella.
I like that. That's a great mindset to have. Now, Eric, we wanted to talk more about Carolina basketball, so I'm going to put you on the hot seat for a minute here. Trust me, I hate all-time lists, but I'm going to ask you, if you needed to win a game right now, and you could pick a starting five of Tar Heels that you covered while working at North Carolina, and you could pick any 5 players that you choose, who would you pick?
Okay, so I've got to win a game. Okay, and let's
say national championship.
Right.
Put the stakes higher.
Right. Well, I mean, so we're going to factor in competitiveness and not just skill level. Remember, I don't go back to the dark ages, so don't yell at me when I don't pick Michael Jordan. I didn't cover him. I think my point guard would probably be Raymond Felton, because I like his toughness and I like his ability. I'd still put Marcus Page in the backcourt and then figure out who's running point guard. I think we'll end up fine. Tyler Hansborough's got to be on the court. Man, after that it gets tricky. I'd probably put Sean May down there with Tyler. Again, we got 2 big guys, but we'll just let them, again, you guys just figure it out. I'm not worried about it. And then who are we going to put out on the wing? I mean, I kind of think I'd like to put Brady Manek with this group just to see what happens. And I think he'd fit in with their personality really well. I'm not sure that he is the pure best player in this stretch to put in that spot, but I'd kind of like to see what happens. So let's go with that. And I know if nothing else, we're gonna have fun and we're gonna be really hard to beat.
And yeah, definitely going to be entertaining. Now, I'm going to give you a Tar Heel name, and just give me the first word or the words that come to describe the individual. Okay.
Okay.
Theo Pinson.
So much fun. How did it take him this long to get into the media world? Unbelievable that it took him this long. He's great at it. He's going to be a star in that for a long time.
Sam Howell.
The opposite of Theo in terms of volume, but very talented. One of the best quarterbacks I've ever seen at Carolina.
While we're on the football subject, let's just go to Drake May.
Yeah, has called me sir more times than probably all my kids put together. Just one of the greatest families in Carolina history.
Luke May.
One of the greatest families in Carolina history. One of the nicest, most genuine, kindest people I think I've ever met. Take out the Carolina part. Just one of the most genuine, thoughtful people I've ever met.
So we talked about Tyler Hansbrough a little bit, but is there one word to describe him?
Fierce, angry, competitive.
I like those words. All right. So Roy Williams.
He is who you see he is, and he is the absolute definition of a Tar Heel.
Joel Berry.
Ooh, tough. He should have been on some of these lists we were making. I love how he didn't get the playing time he thought he deserved and just figured it out for himself how to make himself better. Kind of a rarity in today's game.
RJ Davis.
Tough. I love that little New York swagger. I love that Coach Davis has brought that back some. Coach Davis really values that from his time with the Knicks, and you're going to love that in Ian Jackson also. Just that little bit of Big Apple chip on his shoulder toughness.
And then before I ask you about this year's team, Armando Bacot.
He might have gotten more out of his time at Carolina than anybody in Carolina history. I mean, he maximized every opportunity in a way that I think we all like to think that we would, but oftentimes don't. And I think that'll benefit him for decades to come.
Now, do you ever envision them changing the criteria to get numbers up in the rafters?
I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility.
That's good to know. Now, you've been watching Carolina basketball, the practices. Do you have any early, takes on this team?
Man, this is a different kind of team than what Carolina fans are used to, just because the depth is in the backcourt and not in the post. The Tar Heels are going to have to score a different way than maybe you're used to. They're not going to throw it down to a big guy and let him post up with his back to the basket and shoot a jump hook over his left shoulder. They're going to have to score in some different ways. They're going to have to create some points in transition off of turnovers. There's going to be some nights where they shoot the lights out and look unbelievable. And then there's going to be some nights where the shots don't go in as much, and they're going to have to find other ways to score. I do think they're going to be fun to watch. There's some really fun individuals on this team. At this point here in October, we don't know how those individuals are going to make a team. But if they do, they're going to be really fun to watch. I think Carolina's capable of being a team that people don't want to play.
And in terms of the newcomers, because there's a lot of new faces on this team, was there one player that stood out when you were watching them, just saying, wow, this guy could really make an impact this year?
I think the guy I knew the least about, who's been the most fun to watch, is Drake Powell. He just has it. I love my North Carolina guys who come to North Carolina and excel, and they understand what it means to be a Tar Heel. But he's more than just like a feel-good local guy story. He's really good, really good. And I think he's going to have some nights this year where you're like, man, how did the Tar Heels find Drake Powell in Pittsburgh? So really looking forward to him develop. And, of course, Tyler Zeller, a big part of his development. Big Z was a volunteer coach at Drake's high school and was raving about him last year at this time. And as per usual, Tyler Zeller right again.
Absolutely. And, I have to thank you for joining us on the show tonight. It was a pleasure to get to talk to you. I look forward to hearing more Carolina Insider podcast and reading more of your work. And again, when I come down to Chapel Hill, I'm going to need a tour of the Pod World headquarters.
I'm afraid you may be disappointed, but we can make that happen. And Nick, I really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you very much for joining in, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, Nick.